Helen is the RCI development lead for the Transfusion 2024 programme. Helen is a biomedical scientist and has worked in RCI Newcastle for 7 years before moving into project management roles. And she's here to talk about the RCI Assist tool, which is one of the projects.
Thanks so much, Carol. Thank you for inviting us. It's really nice to come and talk about the project. For all, I've gone over to the dark side and I now do project management rather than biomedical science. My passion is transfusion science and particularly education. Essentially, what is RCI Assist? I could spend the whole half hour talking about what the tool itself is, but I thought I'd rather give you a very quick overview and then we're going to do a case and work through it together. But there's a programme called Transfusion 2024. And what this was, it's a programme that's sort of there to help support the hospital transfusion labs and build the relationships up between NHSBT and the labs, coming into your labs almost and giving you support. I've kind of plugged this as RCI in your pocket, so you've got access to the knowledge from RCI in your laboratory now. And it's a guide, so when you're processing samples in your transfusion lab, you can use the tool to help support your decisions, whether you're going to resolve that in-house or if you need to refer it to RCI. And it's just about improving your confidence as well. You know, it's quite daunting. Carol mentioned earlier, you know, transfusion's never black or white, it's never straightforward. So this is here to help you. It's really straightforward. It asks you questions as we go along, which you're going to see. You answer yes or no, and it just moves you on to the next part to where you need to be. It's available as a link in Spice, and I know not everyone has access to Spice, so at the end of this month it'll be coming out in OBOS as well. So there's just a link and it just takes you to a web page for you. So we're just going to make a start. And like I said, there's some polls here. You've got 62-year-old females came into your lab. They've had a group and screen. These are the results that you're presented with. They've requested 2 units of red cells. You've got that wonderful diagnosis of anemia, which we all know and love, and it's a really helpful diagnosis. So fantastic. That's really helpful. Thanks for that in the clinical area. You've not seen them before. We have information that this patient was transfused at another hospital 5 years ago. There's no historical antibodies. You've checked on your limbs, so you can check on Spice, and that there's nothing on Spice because this patient hasn't previously been seen by RCI. But you can assume it's the last time they were seen, there was no antibodies. We've said there's no historical. So the first rule is your ABO and D interpretable. And there's some hot information contained within the tool. So when you're going through it, we've tried to put everything in there that will help you with your investigation. So at the top, you press the little information icon. Is your group interpretable? It'll tell you what an interpretable group is. There's a note there to say that your neonates can be considered interpretable from the forward group. And then talking about your strength of reactions, there would need to be strong reactions for your forward ABO and D group. Reverse groups maybe we can, and most Tim covered that this morning. So there's Mr. Landsteiner. So his law, just in case you don't know it, whichever ABO antigen is not present on the red cells, the corresponding antibodies found in the plasma. And these are naturally occurring. This is why we need to make sure that we get the ABO right, because you can produce you've already made those antibodies that are there in case you want to give somebody the wrong blood. Is this group interpretable?
We've got 92% saying yes.
So this is an interpretable group. So you've got your forward and reverse groups matching in accordance with Landsteiner's law, and we'll have strong positive reactions there in our D group. So you would press yes. So it's simple. You've answered your question. Is the group interpretable? Yes. You press the button and it moves you on to the next part. And there's a button appears and it says go to the antibody ID section. So you press this. And you can see there you have actually changed page, even though the question box is sort of looks quite similar, but there's a grey tab across the top now, and that's how you know if you're in a different section. And your next question is your antibody screen positive? There's a little pop of information there just telling you what a positive screen is. Nothing overly complicated. So is this a positive antibody screen? So yes, that is a positive antibody screen. So you move on. So we're saying yes, we've got a positive screen. So you move on. The next prompt that it brings you up here, you'll see there's a little sort of blue box there and it has a number on it. The number, whenever there's a point within the tool where you refer to RCI, it brings up a number. If you wanted to, you could write this on your request form when you're sending something over. This first point here is just for any lab that don't hold a panel. And when you press the information button, it just says, you don't have a panel, you're going to have to refer this to RCI, because there are some labs out there, tend to be private hospitals, some private hospitals. But for us, we're moving on to the next question. So we want to check the patient history, because it's not just the results of your investigation, it's everything you use in all your patient history. So does the patient have a known antibody? So we want to have a little checkpoint here. And our patient here, we've been told that they don't have a historical antibody. So we're going to press no. So we've got a positive screen, but they don't have any known antibodies. So here it's now saying, right, now is the time to perform your primary panel. So you've done a grouping screen, now we're moving on to the panel. And you just do this in accordance with your local manufacturer or your SOPs. So with the tool itself, it can guide you through, but it doesn't tell you what to do. So if you didn't do a primary panel, I can't make you do one, but obviously it's sort of saying, please do a primary panel. So here's one I've done earlier, and I appreciate this looks really complicated, so I'm not asking anybody to do the antibody ID. I love doing antibody IDs and I would spend all day doing them, but they can take a bit of time, so I want to sort of get you through the tool rather than do that. So like I said, here's one I've did earlier. So we've got a possible anti-big K, anti-M, an enzyme-only anti-big E, and we haven't been able to exclude anti-JKB and anti-LUA. So a bit of a stinker for you want to go through this, but what I want you to see is on the surface of it, it looks like it's quite complicated, and you might go, oh, this is awful. There's potentially 3, even 5 antibodies here. How am I going to use RCI Assist to support me in this? So looking at that primary panel, the next question that it asks you is, have you identified a pan-reactive antibody by IAT? The reason this question's in here is even though your screen wasn't pan-reactive, sometimes depending on the technology that you use, or there might just be so many antibodies in there, the panel happens to give you a pan-reactive. But in this case, it's not. This is what we suspect that we've got, so we're going to say no. And then what it does, it brings up a series of questions here. There's a pop of information, and this has been put in, so it's asking you if you've identified any antibodies, have you excluded any clinically significant antibodies, is your patient pregnant, and have they previously been seen by RCI? And we'll put some hints and tips in here. So when you're doing your investigations in the lab, the first one, know the clinical significance of your antibodies, so that's in your BSH guidelines. Confirm your antibodies as other antibodies, doing phenotyping. Don't forget about dosage of cells. Sometimes if your antibody shows dosage, particularly anti-M, it might miss some of the cells. Remember which ones are destroyed by enzyme, because that's really helpful when you're doing your antibody investigations. You can have cold antibodies that might interfere with things. Sometimes column agglutination technology is not our friend. You do something in the lab, you get lots and lots of scruffy reactions, and you can't really do anything with it. And sometimes you can get pan-reactivity in enzymes, which can actually produce some non-spec reactions by IAT. So these are just things that are there to help you when you're thinking about your antibody identification. So very quickly, this isn't in there, but I thought because this is an education session, you know, we'll just quickly talk about your panel cells. And I know Zoe touched upon this earlier. So when you include in antibodies, the panel cells, they're not just random, they're made up in a particular way, so that 8 or more donor group O donor cells, they cover the commonly encountered clinically significant antibodies. And really, for a single specificity antibody, you should have 2. You should be able to get it. But for each of your antigens, you've got to have 2 positive examples and 2 negative examples. You have 1 R1R1, which is that phenotype there, and then something that includes a CW as well. Between all these cells, they've got to contain your big A, little k, Duffy A, Duffy B, JK, JKB, big S, and little s. You've got to have an example of an R2R2 one on there, and you need at least 3 examples of D neg cells, so that's your little r, which again have to have a certain sort of profile. So there's a reason the cells are the way they are. When you're excluding your antibodies, you really need, once you've identified one, it's really important to exclude the presence of any additional ones. And these are all just taken from BSH guidelines if you want to go and have a look. basically failure to recognise these could cause a transfusion reaction, particularly your kids, your S's and your Duffies. And when you exclude them, you've got to use, you can just use one example, but it's got to be homozygous. So the cells, if you are wanting to exclude an EJKA, you'd have to make sure the cell that you are excluding on isn't JKA pos, JKB pos. Hopefully that makes sense. So, happen to be talking about kid antibodies here. Going back to our panel, so we can't exclude anti-JKB. We're just going to have a little look in. So I've just taken a screenshot there of the anti-JKB. And I'm going to ask you why we can't exclude this. So is it because the JKB is being masked by other antibodies? We've got a lot of stuff going on there. Is it because the JKB pos cell and the other antigen negative one, so this cell has to be negative for all the other antibodies that we think are there as well? So it's really limiting how much we can exclude the JKB with. Are these a single dose expression, so the heterozygous? So this cell is JKA pos, JKB pos. Or is it homozygous? So it's only JKB pos, which is good, but it's negative for everything else. Or it's masked and it's showing dosage. So you can see in the red there, these are all the JKB pos cells. We do have, it's a bit of a combination. So you've got some where it's being masked by the presence of your other antibodies. So you couldn't use those first couple of cells there, lines 2 and 3. Even lines 5 and 6, they are masked by other antibodies, but the ones that I've sort of highlighted in red there, they show heterozygous expression. So what I mean by that is the cell is both JKA pos and JKB pos. So therefore, according to your BSH guidelines, you can't use this cell because it's got to be homozygous expression, which would be like a double dose, like 2 genes of the JKB, in order to exclude it. So what would you do next? What I would do, so you've got a couple of options here. So you could look at your screening cell, or use another panel cell, or you could phenotype your patient, but we'll just save that for the time being. So the way I've looked at this here is I've gone, can't use cells 1 and 3 because they are also M pos and K pos, and I think I've got an M and a K. I do have a negative reaction, so technically I could exclude anti-JKB on a homozygous cell line there by IAT because my enzyme, it's enzyme only for big E, but technically if you're following the guidelines, they've got to be negative for all other antibody specificities there. So just to be on the safe side, extra panel cell that's homozygous for your JKB, but negative for the other antibodies that you suspect there. And the eagle-eyed amongst you might be thinking, well, right, you've excluded JKB now, Helen, but what about anti-LUA? Is anti-LUA clinically significant? Something not sure, and that's absolutely fine, because if you weren't sure, the joy about RCI Assist is that it contains links to your BSH guidelines. So here I put in the likely significance for all of the antibodies which we have, and LUA on the bottom there, likely to be clinically significant, no. So we don't actually have to actively exclude it. Let's not worry about it. And now, so going back to the panel there, so we've excluded JKB this time, and we're not really concerned about anti-LUA. And with your guidelines, remember that you need 2 positive examples, 2 negative examples to confirm the presence of your antibodies. So we have got 2 examples of anti-M there and 2 negative examples that are negative for any of the other antibodies. Same with your BK. 2 pos, 2 neg. However, just as a note, you can't use cell 6 because that's positive for the K and the M, so you wouldn't be able to use that to confirm them. Now looking at what big E, so we know I'm saying there's an enzyme big E there, but actually I can't see there definitely is. I've got 2 negative examples, which are negative for the other. One's not negative for the antigen, sorry, so I've only got 1 negative example, and I've only got 1 positive example. Note here the patient's auto's negative. It's in this case it's not relative. Sorry for the spoiler. But it may be if it was positive. That's something you've got to consider on your phenotype. So we're querying. We've got that enzyme big E, but we definitely know there's an M and a big E there now. And again, not worried about LUA. So what would you do next? So what I've said here is you would need to confirm the presence of the enzyme big E on an E pos K neg M neg cell, but you could do your phenotyping as well. But really, to confirm the presence of that antibody, you do want to see it's there. The phenotype decision as to whether it's an antibody or not. So, in terms of this, we've now said, yeah, we've got our antibodies, so we've gone off and confirmed that big E's there. So we've identified antibodies. We've excluded the additional clinically significant antibodies because we're not worried about anti-LUA. The patient isn't pregnant, and it's not been previously seen by RCI. I've already talked about those hints and tips, but you can see how that might help you. So we'll say yes to 1 and 2. So I press that button, it brings up a few boxes here. There's one here I'm not going to cover too much, but it's just basically saying about covering considering the ethnicity of your patient, and if you've got a positive auto, but we don't in this case. You do have an option to refer to RCI if you want to. You might want those antibodies confirmed by RCI. We're going to look, has the patient been transfused in the last 3 months? So they haven't been previously transfused, but were transfused at another hospital 5 years ago. So we're not thinking about if they've been recently transfused. So what we can do is press no, and now we can perform a phenotyping. If the patient had been recently transfused, we couldn't do a phenotype because there's a mixture there of donor red cells. So you would go down a different pathway, but we don't need to worry about that. And here there's just some information on as to why it's really important to perform your phenotyping. So you want to know if it's an alloantibody, because then you would be required to give antigen negative blood. It mentions that if you're auto positive, that might interfere with some of the anti-sera that we use, just things like that. And if you don't have suitable reagents in your lab, you can refer to RCI. So you've got this little 0.9 here. It might be that you know what these antibodies are, but your lab just doesn't host the anti-sera, which is fair enough. Not all labs have it. But luckily you work somewhere that does. And one of the things to think about with your guidelines here, this is where they come in. The patient's made an Rh antibody, so they've got anti-big E, and the guidelines say if they make an Rh antibody, you need to perform that extended phenotyping, and this is to help you select the right cells. Your lab performs M and K typing, and the patient's negative for both of those. This means that autoantibody, and we've also confirmed that there are no pos using the second group. So these are the patient results. So they're an R1, just if you use that sort of terminology. K-neg, M-neg, with an allo-anti-M, an allo-anti-K, and an enzyme-only allo-anti-big E, and not excluded LUA. So the patient's not pregnant, so we're going to press no. And now we're going to ask, do we want any blood? So we want 2 units of red cells for this patient. So you press the yes button because you want a transfusion. If you press no, you would just at that point input on your limbs. So you don't, even though that's quite a complicated investigation, you've had to do lots of things to it. There's 3 antibodies there, but you've resolved the issue, so you can just input and put that in-house. So now it takes you, when you press that button, you go to the transfusion page, and it asks if you've been transfused in the last 6 weeks. This question relates to elution. So if your patient had been transfused in the last 3 months, you couldn't do phenotyping, but if they've been transfused in the last 6 weeks, then we're thinking that's LUA territory. But in this case, it's not. So we're going to say no. If it did need an LUA, it would take you to the elution question section and ask you questions there. So we want 2 units of red cells. Sometimes it does ask you the same question twice. And the reason for that is, if I just had a query about a transfusion, I could go into the RCI Assist and just go straight to the transfusion tab. So sometimes it does repeat. It's just to make sure that we're not missing anything out. So now I'm going to say yes, and there's a pop-up information here. So it's saying select red cells which are ABO compatible, D and K compatible, and antigen negative for any clinically significant antibodies and in line with any special requirements. So it's not saying you have to select group O, big E neg, K neg, for example. It just sort of says look at your guidelines, and there's a hyperlink there to the guidelines if you weren't sure about the significance. So these are our patient results again. What blood would you select for this patient? Okay. So thinking about what we discussed, looking at BSH guidelines and things, are you going to give O, R1, K neg, M neg? Are you just going to give group O, B neg, K neg, M neg? Do we want those combinations with LUA? Or if you're not sure, that's absolutely fine. What you do need to think about in this case, and again, it's a little bit of a trick, so the patient doesn't have an antenatal C. However, if you go on your BSH guidelines, this patient has made an RH antibody, therefore would do the RH extended phenotyping, and in order to prevent further alloimmunization, it does recommend that you give antigen negative blood for the extended RH, so it would be recommending R1R1s, provided this does not impede the provision of transfusion support. So if it's not like urgent life or death for this patient, get some R1R1s for these, and that's going to prevent them from making an antenatal C. So there we go. There's our R1R1 K-neg, M-neg. You may have those in stock. You may need to order them. Obviously, things are going to depend on the urgency of your patient and stuff. So is we cross-match compatible? In this case, yes, it is. We've cross-matched those OR1R1 K-neg, M-neg units. You've got negative reactions by IAT, therefore the cross-match is compatible. If it was incompatible and you press no, well, there's a box on there and it'll say, have you selected the right patient group? Have you selected the right patient sample? You know, said earlier on, it doesn't always have to be something really, really complicated. You might have just picked up the wrong sample. Or the antigen negative units. It would be typical that you would cross-match it, get an incompatible one, and it might be that they do have an anti-LUA, and out of all of the units in the world, you've picked up the LUA POS one. What you could do if you do get an incompatible cross-match, just try another unit. That normally resolves it. But if you kept getting incompatible units, you could just send it over to RCI. So this time it's compatible. We're saying yes. Input on the limbs. Excellent, that's it. Really complicated, lots of antibodies, lots of things going on, but we can resolve it and we can keep it in-house. So that's the whole point of the tool, is just to try and help you guide your way through the investigation rather than looking at it and going, oh, that's really scary. So you just input on your limbs and we're all done. But I hope you found that really helpful.
Thank you so much.